people because he made all kinds of false accusations and got this country on fire for a number of years. So this isn't the first time George Wallace, I remember growing up watching George Wallace and Lester Maddox. Yeah, this has been done before, but it's never been done by the President of the United States on live TV, and it's unmistakable what he was telling them to do.
It was wild. So let's ask this. Now, this is the part where we need further civics lessons. So
sure.
Now, in these days after what happened, a lot of people are invoking the 25th Amendment. And people are like, well, what is that all about? Now, that's a complicated situation. And, for all we know, if they were to invoke that, they wouldn't necessarily have to tell the public. I mean, there's a lot of things about this. Talk about what that means. What it means is that the sitting cabinet by a majority would have to inform the vice president that they believe the president should be removed either because of his mental state or his seditious acts, and the vice president would have to agree, and then the vice president would have to take that, and the 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate would have to agree for it to happen. And with the time periods that are allowed, we probably would run out of time if we did it tomorrow. Now, not necessarily, but realistically, we probably wouldn't. The chances of getting 2/3 of anything in the present House and Senate are probably nil. So the second alternative to that is what Nancy Pelosi is talking about. If Pence doesn't get back to her shortly, apparently, according to the Washington Post, he hasn't returned her call on this issue. And so if they were to put out articles of impeachment, vote on them, likely have it pass in the House because it's just a majority, then it would go to the Senate for a 2/3 vote. That's highly unlikely, but politically it makes everybody take a stand in the Senate. And in terms of practicality, is he actually going to be removed? That's unlikely. And I saw today in the Washington Post this afternoon, actually, reported that Speaker Pelosi said she spoke with the General Milley, Chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, about the unstable person in the White House having access to nuclear codes. And his own office confirmed that there was a conversation with Pelosi about nuclear codes. It wouldn't say further, which to me says everything we needed to know. So here's a second question that goes along with this. Even if it is capable of being done, doesn't that create a further diversion and a further rift for those who believe what they believe? Does this create an even more likely situation where the next person, that party could say, well, look, now we really have a reason. They did get rid of this guy, even though he did blah, blah, blah. Do you create even further division by forcing, the public humiliation, despite what happened? Does that function in a way that could blow up in your face?
Okay, so do we live life in fear, or do we live life with our principles? Because if we live in fear of alienating people, yet we're doing something right, then what do we have? Do we really have a righteous republic? Because if whatever percent of those 74 million people, is there a percent that thinks what happened on Wednesday was okay, then it will be very hard to have a rational discussion with them, because it's not okay under any circumstances. So if we do something, whether it's the 25th Amendment or impeachment, and we do it in a civil manner under the laws of our country, then you can live with what the result is because you did it civilly and peacefully. And what happened the other day was the losing party not accepting defeat for a peaceful transfer of power and essentially inciting an insurrection. That's very different.
Yeah, it is. And again, one of the things I want to stress here is the fact that, the same way that we didn't want people, the people who said, well, the Black Lives Matter people looted and burned. No, they didn't. There was a very small fringe element that caused some problems at the end of peaceful protest. The same thing with this. We're not indicting the entire Republican Party for what happened the other day.
Of course not.
There was a fringe element that showed up in D.C. and were inspired to violence. And they did that of their own accord. And one of the questions I have is, this one really blew my mind, and this makes me very, very uncomfortable. If a crowd of basically not very well armed people can breach the Capitol. What happens if that was a real insurrection by an organized group heavily fortified with weapons? If those guys got into the House, that told a very bad story about the security at the Capitol, doesn't it?
Yes, and there's no question that President Biden will be appointing a commission, as will the Congress, to investigate this incredible failure of security in our iconic Capitol. And I saw today that the Washington Post also this afternoon was reporting that Virginia and D.C. and Maryland were calling for National Guard troops, and allegedly the Defense Department turned them down in real time when it mattered. So we'll find out about that. That's right now an allegation. Yeah. But you are absolutely correct. This is a monumental failure to protect our sacred government. And let's face it, there's a lot of reasonable theories that the people that breached were in there to possibly take congressmen and women and senators hostage. I mean, that would have been viable if they hadn't escaped in time, right?
Right. And what would have happened if the elector votes, which I saw being taken out, what if those were grabbed? Was there anything that, I mean...
Okay, so, good question. So, number one, the person that took them with them is an absolute hero that thought on her feet and got them out of there. They are the originals. The answer is we would have had a process whereby we could have reproduced them, and I don't think that would have been an issue.
But it was a crazy situation, and and that's one of those things where what are the... And again, this creates a whole second conversation because, we saw the National Guard armed to the teeth during some of the Black Lives Matter movement protests this summer. None of that was illustrated the other day, which asked the question, is there unequal justice? Which I don't think there's a real honest question. I don't think anyone could honestly say, no, justice is completely equal for everybody. And Vice President-elect Biden, when he introduced Merrick Garland and his other three nominees yesterday, directly said it, that if these protesters were black or brown, would this have gone down the same way? The answer is no. It's hard to process this as where we are, but it is, and I mentioned this earlier. Someone had said, we're better than this, America, but it kind of illustrates over the past decade or so, we're not better than this. This is kind of who we are.
So, you're obviously a big sports fan like me.
Oh, of course.
And I know this won't be a popular name for New England, but Bill Parcells once said, you are what your record says you are.
Oh, we love Bill. So he turned around this franchise. So
he did turn around, but I know, still with the Giants background here. Yeah, but so Bill said it correct. You are what your record says you are. This is who we are right now. Yeah. Not our whole country, obviously, and hopefully not the majority of our country, I don't think. But this is our country right now. I mean, we need a lot of very honest discussions and a lot of very honest actions to turn this around.
No, we really do. So when we talk about the voter reform that we see, what we can do, what are some of the things that you think are out there? Because, again, you wrote the book, Voting, the Ultimate Act of Resistance. And, again, this is New York City voting rights and trial attorney Richard C. Bell we're talking to. Talk about how we can go further with voter reform, because we've seen great turnout, and we want to see this turnout continue, and we want to make sure that accessibility to voting, so many challenges were put out there, like to mail-in ballots, and the idea that we have to limit the way you can vote, I think is crazy. I think this way was functional. Do you see problems with it?
Okay, so first of all, one of the first acts passed by the House when Nancy Pelosi took over is the voting rights reforms and things like the extension of mail-in ballots, the same-day registration, automatic registration. A lot of the things that happened because of COVID, even though that bill came before COVID, are things we need to extend. Okay, it's obvious, more voting places, not purging rolls. Those things are all obvious. I don't know if they can obviously be passed, but they're all obvious, and we know they work. But then there's a whole group of things that should happen as a result of what we saw Wednesday that have been around for decades by law professors and voting rights lawyers that nobody thinks about. Maybe they'll start thinking about it. I'll give you a few. I'll rattle them off. So, number one, What you saw in Michigan when you had that ceremonial canvassing board and they were about to not accept the results of the election, you don't, state by state, if you have these ceremonial boards that are basically clerical, get rid of them. You only need state and local administrators who actually determine the vote totals, obviously subject to any court challenges, but you don't need these ceremonial people that all of a sudden one afternoon decide they're going to talk to the president and they're going to try to overturn the results of an election. So that's a simple one the states can do. Another thing the states can do is they can bar their legislators by law that you cannot choose rival slates of electors to go to the Electoral College, that you can say, no, you have to choose one. We have to resolve it, and internal issues will resolve. But it didn't happen this time. The last time it happened was in 1876. But you don't want any chance, because you saw what happened. Number of legislators wanted that to happen, where they'd send in their own slate. There should be a rule that says the term failed election in that Electoral Count Act specifically means a failed election. There was a natural disaster. Nobody could vote, and we couldn't vote for 12 weeks. That's a real failed election. Short of that, it shouldn't be. How about you have a federal law that raises the threshold of objecting to the Electoral College votes, meaning you can't have Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz make unsubstantiated political posturing. You force them under law to have specified, substantiated lists of allegations of fraud before you would even entertain it, so that at least you have exactly what it's about, and it's not just political rhetoric. I think that's another good one. Another one is that the federal government could make sure that the Electoral Count Voters Act is changed, so the time within which states to meet and resolve their problems isn't what this year was December 14th. Maybe you make it January 1st. You give a lot of time for the courts and the legislature to iron out problems, so that when those votes are cast, it is in stone. And you can also have that act amended from 1887. It's been amended a couple of times, but that is the most ambiguous act that most professors and lawyers have ever seen, because you could argue either side of the issue of what is the role of governors, what is the role of the vice president, what if you take away one slate and now you're below 538 and nobody can get to 270. Does that mean a plurality? Does that mean you have to put in another slate? These are unanswered questions. You can't have these as unanswered questions anymore. Right. And then just a couple quick things for lawyers, because the lawyers for the Trump campaign, in my opinion, they defiled my profession, because you should have laws both at the state and federal level that say if you're contesting an election, in your complaint that you're filing with the court, it has to specifically state whether there is an allegation of fraud, and if so, there should be a standard of specificity where you have to list exactly what your allegations are. And if a judge doesn't find fraud, the court should be required to state that, so when it goes on appeal, it's not ambiguous what the judge said. And then you should have an ethics rule for state bar associations. As a lawyer, I'm an officer of the court. When I say something to the court takes it as true. And if it's not true, I can lose my license. So you should have an ethics rule that says if you allege voter fraud on the steps of the courthouse and incite people and then go inside the courthouse like Rudy Giuliani and admit to the judge in Pennsylvania, no, there's no allegations of fraud, that's an ethics violation that should be have a severe penalty to it. And then, of course, the House and the Senate should have their own internal rules. If you're a candidate and you won your House race and then you proclaimed that the election was a fraud and it was rigged, but for the president, but not for me, I think that's something that should be investigated.
No, they're all great points. Well, look, it's always a great conversation with you, Attorney Bell. Again, New York City voting rights and trial attorney Richard C. Bell. The book, Voting, The Ultimate Act of Resistance. If you hadn't been inspired to read a book about voting, I think that we've seen just how important it is. This is an important book. Also, the website, richardcbellesq.com. It is always a great conversation. I appreciate your time.
No, my honor, Mike. I really enjoy these because you ask the tough questions, and I'm not afraid to give you the tough answers.
Always appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you.